So after looking at the GDP in detail, we want to ask, is GDP a perfect measurement for the economic performance of a nation? Given that we say perfect in here, for sure it is not perfect. So in the next following minutes, we want to talk about the issues of GDP. That is, what are the missing components of GDP? So when we talk about GDP, we know GDP is a very important economic variable. We use that to describe the income of a nation or the economic performances of a nation. But somehow this measurement is not perfect because there is something that is not included in the GDP computation. So we want to discuss and think about what may be the missing components of the GDP. So to begin with, we want to wrap up the definition of the GDP. So to begin with, when we want to look at what is the missing components of GDP in describing the wealth of a nation or the economic performances of a nation, I want you to think about the definition of the GDP. We say that the GDP is the market value of the goods and services, especially the final goods and services, that is newly produced within a country's border during a specific period of the time. Therefore, if the goods does not sell and bought in the market, then it will not include in the GDP. Therefore, the first component that is missing for GDP computation is the goods that is produced but there's no market transaction associated with that particular goods, then it will not be included in the GDP computation. So what could be that type of the goods? For example, when you plant potatoes in your backyard and then you eat the potatoes that you grow, then in fact that potato is not sold in the market and then bought by that is the final user. Therefore, it will not count as the part of the GDP. But in fact, that you still eat that potato, so it should be the production of the economy, but no one knows that. Therefore, the value of those kind of product will not be included in the GDP. Therefore, missing the value of this type of goods in computing the GDP, it usually underestimate the GDP. The second type is the opposite. It is also the item not bought and sold in the market, but when not considering this, it will overestimate the GDP. So in here, the items that we talk about include the changes in the health. Imagine that an engineer produces a good that worth $1 billion, which is quite a lot, and it will contribute greatly to GDP. And we are going to add the GDP by $1 billion because of that contribution. However, it could be the case once the engineer produces that goods that is worth $1 billion, then that person is hospitalized, and then because it got super ill, then the loss of the health of that engineer doesn't count as the losses of GDP, which is not right, because potentially that person can produce more goods, but given that person loses the health, then it no longer can produce goods. Probably we don't care about it, but the changes in the health is somehow a loss of the economy. And then for that losing, it doesn't count negatively on the GDP. So another similar item will be the changes in the environment. We know that for the country that is producing oil, they will drill the oil and then sell the oil. But then once they drill the oil from the ground, they no longer have that. It will deplete the natural resources. But the depletion of the natural resources doesn't count negative to the GDP. Again, for those type of goods, the GDP is created, but the intermediate goods or the depletion of the natural resources doesn't count as negative to the GDP. So again, when ignoring the changes in the environment, it in fact overestimated GDP. So when talking about the depletion of the natural resources, probably it can be debatable that whether or not the changes or the depletion of the natural resources, whether or not it can count as the GDP, we can think about it twice, because you can say, well, even though it's depletion of the natural resources, but it's something I'm gifted and I can I can sell it and then becomes my income, so it's not all bad. But can you imagine that when we want to produce goods, we pollute our air and we destroy the beautiful thing of the mountain? For those changes in the environment, it is something that cannot be bought and sold, but once you lose it, you are going to lose it forever. It may not come back, and that is a loss to the nation's wealth. But when we are pursuing higher GDP, we may sacrifice those gifted goods, and then in exchange for more goods that is produced. Whether or not it's worthwhile to do that, we can think about it twice. But again, you need to remember, when there's changes in an environment, it doesn't count as the negatively to the GDP. So then when we destroy or damage our environment for producing goods, then whether or not it's the improving of the wealth of the nation can be think twice. The next missing component of the GDP will be the leisure. We know that leisure is not bought and sold in the market, but we know, well, it can be bought and sold in the market, because once you give up your leisure, you work, you are going to be paying wages. But then the happiness of the leisure will not be bought and sold. So then when you work hard, you lose this leisure, you lose the time that you can hang around with your family. Those missings are not compensated, and those missings does not show up negatively to the GDP. Therefore, the GDP have missing of these components. The GDP can be an indicator for the well-being of a nation, but it is not perfect, because it doesn't count the losses of the health as negatively to the GDP. It doesn't count the changes in the environment, especially the pollutions, as a negative to the GDP. It doesn't count the loss of leisure as a negative to the GDP. So for those kind of losses, it will definitely undermine the welfare of the nation, but it will not reflect it in the GDP. Finally, the next one is about the items bought and sold in the market secretly. The previous item is the item not bought and sold in the market. The next type is the item that is bought and sold in the market secretly. Once it is bought and sold secretly, for sure the government statistic will not include that. So it may be the case that when there are a lot of the goods that are bought and sold secretly in the market, then the GDP computation will in fact underestimate the true value of product in the economy. So what type of the transaction can involve the item bought and sold in the market secretly? The night market without the receipt, or the underground economy. Those transactions are not in the statistic because they conduct secretly. Who knows it? But those transactions also have some market value, and it is produced within the country's border during some specific period of time. It should be counted as GDP, but we admit that we miss it. But there's nothing we can deal with that. So then finally, the government services. When government provides good services, then it will improve the quality of life of the individuals in the nation. However, those services do not have the right price to reflect the quality of the government services. So then those are not included in the GDP. Another government services, that is the government transfer, it will be able to improve the equality of the nation, so it will for sure raise the welfare of the nation. However, it will not be included in the GDP. So in here, we admit that even though when we are looking at the economic performances of a nation or the good being of a nation, a lot of time we look at the GDP. but the GDP is not perfect measurement for the welfare of the nation. So we know that when we want to better understand the well-being of the nation, we not only need to look at the GDP, but we need to take into account all the other factors. But anyway, GDP is not too bad a way to measure the living standard of a nation, but we admit that there are some missing components. And this completes the discussion related to GDP.